This is a story called No Man's Land, and my name is Karen Lillis. Greenpoint. This was the place of houses all in a row, the place where people came home to, bought their groceries, walked their babies around the block. A few miles away was the city, and in between was a dirty river, and next to that, a place unnamed, a place bordered to the north by a creek that was dirtier than the river, a sort of no man's land. This no man's land had many men, in fact, but they were men without faces, men without names. She who lived among the houses, she lived so close but never knew this place, until one day she crossed Nassau Avenue and kept walking west towards the river, and found Norman Avenue, and beyond that this strange and wild no man's land. It changed everything. She thought she knew what the whole area looked like, but she realized that every time she strolled down a street not covered before, it was nothing like she'd pictured it. It wasn't like the city, with its endless gray buildings, the same wherever you went. Greenpoint was a different color block by block. And still, no man's land was nothing like the rest of the place. It had a wide sky and fat birds who sat on telephone wires that sagged as if they weren't in use. There were funny yards only half guarded by chain-link gates that housed long trucks and invisible activity. Somewhere there was a plant for culling the city's waste, but she couldn't distinguish it from the other yards, strange as they all looked to her. Today she set out for no man's land. From the start, her feet pointed her there. She could see the no place from her street, and she'd always been able to see it, except that the houses framed her view and she didn't know what she was looking at. She was headed for the water. Not the river, but the creek that divided no man's land and the next place, Queens. She had been to the creek before, had stood on the bridge and looked east and inland towards Brooklyn. With her eyes wide open, she saw the waste pit that the water had become, oil shining across it, factory trash bobbing about it like drowning sea monsters. Then she squinted to see past that, and with her eyes almost closed, she could peer into another time. She could see the beginning of this century that was about to end. There the creek ran clean and flowed like rain. A freight train followed the creek and sent steam rising upward to mingle with the clouds. And in her mind's eye, the drawbridge that she stood on opened slowly, letting through a wooden boat with proud sails. Now she had reached Norman Avenue. She could feel the water, not the creek, but the river that ran inside of her, from her heart to the no place below her belly. Usually she felt it strongest as she was falling asleep or coming out of a dream, but she knew that her dreams swam in that river all night long, back and forth, from the middle of her bed to her pillow. A man passed her, riding a bike. He was dressed in a gray wool hat and a gray wool coat, but she saw that his eyes, too, were gray, the same shade, and they were clear and bright, and then they smiled at her, and his mouth, too. She guessed that he was an artist, for there were artists that lived there, on the street that ran between the houses and the no place. And she watched him for a few minutes afterwards, biking in circles around the street. Sometimes he was facing her, and sometimes it was his back. Sometimes he looked at her, and sometimes his bike turned away. And she felt the river move again as his bike rounded the corner to make a circle around the whole block. Her feet kept taking her forward, and here she was in no man's land, carrying the water inside her down the wide open streets. She who lived among the houses, this was the longest journey she would need to make. She lived so close, but her commute to the city across the river didn't take her half as far as stepping over the asphalt of Norman Avenue. Her back clenched among the houses, and she had to wait for nightfall to find the river in her bed. And her muscles clenched around the crowds of the city as well. Whether it was at work or at a bar, it didn't matter. They were the same people after all. They still went home somewhere to houses in a row. In no man's land, she could do something she'd never thought to before. She could search for the water in the sunlight. Now that she had crossed Norman Avenue, she could feel her muscles let out grateful sighs, like at bedtime, only she could still stand and walk. She was much closer to the water already, she could tell, closer to finding this place that brought a torrent of dreams and images. She wondered if it would be there today, the creek she had seen last time, blue enough to feed cornfields, swift enough to move boats. She found that walking was good for unclenching the muscles, but only if you were walking in the right direction. Not if you were going from the houses to the city, from one place to the same place. No, it was best if you were headed for some place you had seen in a dream. Ancient water you hoped also existed on the map. She passed a lumberyard on her left, and the men stopped to watch her walk by, and one called her beautiful before she got out of earshot. No one called her beautiful on the other side of Norman Avenue, and she never felt beautiful there. She felt darker and heavier and more bundled than the others who dressed up to walk down Nassau Avenue, or to ride the L train, or to sit in an unlit Manhattan theater. But today her hips swayed as she walked through no man's land, and she held her chin up, looking for the water. She looked behind her at the man who had spoken, and he had a strong back and sincere eyes, so she let his word land on her and gave him a smile in return. And she walked on, believing him a little bit, because she was on this side of Norman Avenue. On the other side, they had two languages. Mass was said in Polish and English, upstairs and down. No Man's Land had its own language entirely. It was closer to the ground, louder through the air, quicker to anger or praise. And the language she dreamed in was different still. She found words in odd places in that nighttime world. A phrase written on her stomach, a sentence on her bedroom wall. And there were some words she had never even seen before, and she wasn't sure if they existed during the daytime at all. She thought about this word sometimes, this word for her, she, and she knew that there was he inside she. She knew because he swam there at night, in the river when she dreamed. And she hoped that there lived a he outside of her too, and that she was walking towards him. There came a blur of bright gray a few streets over, and she knew it was the artist, even though she had last seen him riding off in the direction of the houses. His circles must be getting bigger, she thought. She wondered how often he traveled from one place to the other, if he rode his bike in circles every day, if he set out from the start to live on Norman Avenue. Did he have a name, and what image was he looking to find on the map? She was rounding the corner of the road that became the bridge, and the bridge was in sight, and the water was in her mind, when a van pulled up alongside her, and the man driving the van asked her what she charged. He said some other things too, but she didn't hear their letters, only their tone, his thick sweet running over gravel, and the lust in his eyes. She looked around to see which direction she should head. There were no houses to guide or comfort her, no straight rows of watchful windows or front yard fences, only a dirt sidewalk, broken asphalt, some weeds, the open sky. She chose a street that ran parallel to the creek and hoped the van didn't follow her. It was not the first time. No, she had grown up with this sort of thing. Men in pickup trucks yelling their crude names for her body and their desires for it. In the beginning, she responded with silence, a stone face, tears that ran down the side of her body they couldn't see. When she grew up a little, her instinct was to scream her own crudenesses back at them until her throat was raw. But today she sensed that life was very short, too short to spend it wasting words and voice, spewing words into the air that didn't land anywhere and that only made the men laugh. Shoot to kill, that's how she felt today, and she picked a bottle off the ground and held it by the neck like a battle axe. The blocks were long in the no place. The wide streets ran long past the strange yards. If the van found her now, she wouldn't have a corner to turn down. She looked over her shoulder and quickened her pace. No sign of him yet. Her muscles were tight now, her senses on guard. This was different than when her back clenched in the world on the other side. There her muscles formed a vice around her heart, tried to silence this organ that beat under her breast, so that the boredom of the others might not wound her so deeply. Now she could feel everything, see everything, hear her heart louder than ever before. In no man's land, the very beating in her chest was her best armor, it seemed. Not the broken bottle at the end of her arm, but the boiling blood with which she would aim it.